When we think about winter today, we picture warm socks, fluffy blankets, and a heater doing all the heavy work while we pretend we're strong and brave. But in the Middle Ages, winter was the boss. It didn't care about your feelings, it didn't care about your to-do list, your job, or your plans. Winter arrived, looked around, and said, "All right, everyone, let's make things difficult." For poor people living back then, winter wasn't a season. It was an opponent. A slow, cold, silent opponent that you couldn't fight, couldn't outrun, and definitely couldn't block on social media. That you could survive it, if you worked carefully and kept moving, even when your toes felt like sad little ice cubes. Picture the world back then. No streetlights, no cars, no buzzing buildings, just long, empty fields, dark forests, and little villages made of wood, mud, and hope. When winter came, everything changed. The sun went down early, and the daylight hours felt like they were on vacation. The sky stayed cloudy most days, like it was bored. Snow fell slowly, covering everything: roofs, roads, sheep, your neighbor's dog, the one bucket you left outside by accident. Basically, anything standing still for too long. The world grew quiet, not peaceful quiet like a spa, more like the quiet of, "Oh wow, everything is too frozen to make a sound." The cold wasn't gentle either. It pushed through old wooden walls, crawled under doors, and slipped through every crack in every cottage. Poor families slept close together at night, not because they were extra loving, but because human body heat was basically the medieval version of central heating. Inside these tiny cottages, you'd find a small fire burning in a hearth. It tried its best, but honestly, it wasn't winning any battles. The fire warmed a small circle around it, and everything else in the house stayed chilly. If you stood too far away, your fingers tingled from the cold. If you stood too close, you roasted like a potato. There was no middle ground, just hot or cold. Good luck choosing. Now, the truth is, the poor couldn't afford to stop working just because the weather was rude. Winter didn't mean take a break. It meant work even harder so you don't starve. Every task became slower, heavier, and more annoying. But still, people went out each day pulling their cloaks tight, wrapping wool around their hands, and preparing to face whatever winter decided to throw at them. But before we talk about all that hard work, let's first understand what winter truly meant for a medieval villager. Imagine waking up before sunrise because most chores needed early light. You open your eyes, and the air inside your home feels colder than the air in your fridge. You can see your breath. Your hair might even have a little frost on it if you slept too close to the wall. You stretch your arms, or at least you try to, because your blanket is basically a frozen sheet of wool that weighs as much as a sheep. Getting out of bed wasn't a soft and cozy moment. It was an act of bravery. You lift the blanket, and the cold rushes in like, "Good morning, I'm still here." You shuffle toward the hearth, hoping last night's embers survived. If they didn't, well, get ready to spend 10 minutes begging damp pieces of wood to please, please catch fire. Outside, the village is silent. Snow crunches under your shoes stuffed with straw, by the way, because leather alone wasn't warm enough. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, drifting slowly in the gray morning air. Somewhere in the distance, a cow moos in a tone that clearly says it also hates winter. The roads are covered in uneven ice. The streams are frozen over. The fields, once filled with golden crops, now look like blank sheets of white. But even in this frozen world, life continues. A few early risers carry buckets to the well, hoping it hasn't frozen solid. Others chop wood, each swing of the axe echoing through the quiet morning air. A tired donkey stands in a corner, looking like it regrets all its life choices. And in the middle of all this, there's you, just one small person in a big, cold world, trying to figure out how to get enough food, keep your family warm, and finish your work without losing your fingers to frostbite. Winter shaped every part of life. It controlled when you woke up, what you ate, what jobs you could do, and how long your day lasted. It made simple things difficult and difficult things nearly impossible. Even walking to another village could turn into a dangerous journey if the roads were icy or if wolves were hungry that week. Yes, wolves. Winter made them cranky too. Villagers learned to move slowly and wisely. Every action mattered. You couldn't waste wood because you needed it to cook and survive the night. You couldn't waste food because fresh crops wouldn't return until spring. You couldn't waste energy because the cold drained your strength like a medieval battery running low. Still, there was beauty in those winters too. Snow made everything look soft and clean. The forests glistened like something from a fairy tale. Icicles hung from rooftops like crystal decorations made by nature itself. And in the evenings, when families gathered around the fire, you could hear stories being told, wool being spun, and quiet laughter mixing with the crackling flames. Life was hard, but people found calm moments hidden inside the struggle. That's what makes their story so powerful. These villagers didn't have much. Not money, not comfort, not fancy clothes, but they had each other. They had routines that kept them grounded. They had simple skills passed down through generations. And most of all, they had the kind of toughness that comes from knowing you must face the cold, whether you like it or not. So, as we begin this journey into the frozen world of medieval life, imagine yourself standing in that early morning village, your breath floating in the cold air, snow under your feet, a soft gray sky overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster is crowing angrily, probably wishing he could go back to sleep. Before we talk about how poor people worked during the freezing winter, we have to understand something important. Medieval life ran on nature's schedule. No alarm clocks, no calendars with cute puppy pictures, no weather apps telling you feels like -10 degrees, but actually it's worse. Everything was controlled by the seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, they weren't just times of the year. They were the rules of life, and winter, especially, loved reminding everyone who was in charge. For a poor medieval villager, the year didn't start in January like ours. It started whenever the fields woke up. When the soil warmed, when the trees began to bud, when the birds returned and started gossiping loudly in the branches, that was the real beginning. Everything else followed from those natural signs. But the moment the warm seasons ended and autumn handed the baton to winter, the entire rhythm of life changed. Imagine living your whole life by these slow, steady beats, sowing seeds, harvesting crops, storing food, repairing tools, and then, finally, winter arrives. And it's like someone pressed pause on half the things you normally do. In the Middle Ages, the arrival of winter was not a surprise. People didn't wake up one morning, see snow, and panic. They knew it was coming. They felt it in the air weeks before, as the wind grew sharper and mornings grew darker. Even the animals knew. Birds gathered in groups and discussed travel plans. Cows mooed with a tone that basically said, "Oh, here we go again." And people, well, they hurried. Because once winter locked the land in ice, there was no bargaining. So during late autumn, everyone rushed to finish tasks before the cold arrived. They harvested the last crops, stored grain in wooden bins, salted meat, dried peas and beans, repaired roofs, stacked firewood, patched clothes, and checked every small detail around the house, because one loose roof tile in November could turn into a wet, miserable disaster in January. But once winter did arrive, the world slowed down. And when I say slowed, I mean slowed. The sun rose late, sometimes after people had already begun their chores, and it set early, leaving long nights that stretched endlessly. Days were short and quiet. The cold made everything heavier: your clothes, your tools, your mood. Even walking felt like carrying a small boulder inside your boots. Unlike today, where winter might mean holidays, warm drinks, and cheesy sweaters, winter in the Middle Ages meant survival mode. You planned your year around it. You respected it. You feared it a little. Okay, a lot. But you also learned to work with it because you had no choice. The seasons shaped every job. In spring, farmers plowed fields and planted seeds. In summer, they worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting hay, tending animals, or weeding crops. In autumn, they harvested everything they possibly could, even the vegetables they didn't like. But winter changed everything. It was the season of waiting, resting, fixing, preserving, and hoping your supplies didn't run out. And that meant your daily chores also changed. Winter work had its own rhythm. Slow, steady, repetitive. The kind of rhythm that honestly could make anyone sleepy if you describe it long enough, which is perfect for your bedtime channel. Let's imagine the daily schedule of a poor villager during winter. You wake up later than in summer because the sun isn't in a hurry. You don't have big farming jobs waiting for you because nothing grows in frozen soil. Instead, you take on tasks that aren't urgent but still important. Mending clothes, spinning wool, repairing tools, checking the animals, chopping wood, fetching water. And because the days are shorter, you don't work as long as you do in summer. Not because you want a break, but because daylight is precious and firewood is limited. Even the sounds of work change with each season. Summer is loud, scythes cutting through wheat, carts rolling across roads, animals complaining about everything. But winter? Winter sounds like crackling firewood, wind pushing against windows, the soft clink of someone sharpening a knife, and the slow movement of wool being spun. It's a subtle soundtrack, gentle and calm. The other big part of the seasons was how they shaped your food. In spring and summer, you ate fresh things, eggs, milk, herbs, vegetables. In winter, not so much. Winter meals were repetitive: porridge, bread, beans, salted meat if you were lucky, and maybe an onion or cabbage from storage. Everything tasted a bit plain, a bit dull, and sometimes a bit sad. But it kept you alive, and that was enough. Even work animals followed seasonal rhythms. Horses, oxen, and donkeys worked heavily during warm months, but in winter, they rested more. They still needed care, feeding, brushing, checking their hooves, but they didn't pull plows or wagons. They had a winter break, which is honestly more vacation time than most peasants got. But the heart of the seasons was the community rhythm. Villagers moved together. When the season changed, everyone changed. They prepared for winter together, worked together, shared news, shared fears, shared food when needed. During winter, families visited each other more. They talked more. They told stories, repaired things, and helped neighbors fix broken fences or leaky roofs. Winter forced people indoors, but it also brought them closer. In a way, winter was the Middle Ages version of quiet time. Not peaceful, not luxurious, definitely not fun, but slower, calmer. It gave people moments to breathe, think, and prepare for the next cycle of hard labor when spring returned. So, understanding the rhythm of the seasons helps us understand why poor people worked the way they did, especially during winter. Winter wasn't an unexpected event. It was a predictable challenge that shaped every choice they made. How much food to store, how much wood to chop, what tasks to finish before the first frost, which clothes to repair, which tools to fix. Life worked like a great circle, a seasonal loop that repeated year after year. And winter was the quiet, cold, gray part of that loop, where the land slept, people slowed down, and everyone waited patiently for the world to warm up again. When you hear the word home, you might picture something warm and comfortable. Maybe a soft bed, a kitchen with snacks, windows that actually close, doors that don't whistle at you when the wind blows. But a poor person's home in the Middle Ages? Yeah, lower your expectations. A lot. These homes were small, simple, and a little bit confused about what the word warm meant. They were built with whatever the villagers had, mostly wood, mud, straw, and hope. And while they weren't pretty or fancy, they were the best people could manage with limited tools, limited money, and unlimited winter. Let's step inside one. You push open the rough wooden door and it creaks loudly, because medieval doors didn't believe in being quiet. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not normal cold, but the kind that crawls around your ankles and tries to become your new roommate. The air inside the cottage feels only a little warmer than outside, and that's thanks to a small fire struggling in the middle or corner of the room. The second thing you notice is smoke. Lots of smoke. Medieval homes had something called a hearth, which is basically a fire pit. But many of these houses didn't have chimneys in the early periods. The smoke drifted up, looked around, and said, I think I'll stay. So the room often stayed hazy, with the smell of wood smoke clinging to everything: your clothes, your hair, your soul. People didn't complain, though. Smoke was actually helpful, because it chased away bugs and dried the thatched roof above. Speaking of roofs, most poor cottages had thatch, dry straw layered thickly. They worked well enough to keep out rain, unless the weather decided to be dramatic. But they also leaked sometimes, especially after a long storm. A leaky roof wasn't just annoying, it meant cold drips of water falling on your face at night. Imagine sleeping and suddenly feeling a freezing drop land on your nose. Pure medieval joy. Walls were made from wattle and daub. Wattle is woven sticks, and daub is a mix of mud, straw, and occasionally animal poop. Yes, poop. Don't make that face. It helped the mixture stick and kept the wind out. Villagers weren't decorating for beauty, they were decorating for survival. Now, furniture. There wasn't much. A simple home usually had a wooden bench, a table, a few stools, and maybe one decent bed for the whole family, or sometimes no bed at all. Many poor people slept on straw mattresses laid on the floor. The straw wasn't exactly luxurious. It poked, it crunched, and sometimes it housed insects that absolutely did not pay rent. But it was better than sleeping on plain dirt. Clothes and tools hung on the walls, because there were no closets. The floor was usually just packed earth. No carpet, no tiles, just dirt swept smooth with a bundle of twigs. If you dropped something, you had to accept that dirt was now part of it forever. And the fireplace, well, that was the star of the home. The whole family gathered around it at night, not because it was cozy like a modern fireplace, but because if you wandered too far from it, your toes might freeze. The fire burned low most days to save wood. Flames weren't pretty and tall. They were small, tired, and a little bit sad-looking, but they kept everyone alive. Let's talk about warmth, or rather the lack thereof. Drafts came through every crack, through the walls, around the door, even up from the floor. If you sat still too long, you'd find yourself shivering. Children sat close to the hearth, while adults often stood or worked farther away because someone had to keep doing chores. You didn't take off your winter cloak inside the house. It stayed on until spring said it was safe. Bedrooms didn't exist for poor families. Everyone slept in the same space, and you didn't have privacy. If someone snored, everyone heard it. If someone kicked in their sleep, someone else suffered. But the togetherness helped keep everyone warm. And here's something fun. Animals sometimes shared the house. Not because people were trying to be quirky or eco-friendly, but because animals produced heat. Chickens, goats, and even sheep sometimes stayed in a small corner at night. They weren't cuddly roommates, but they were warm, and heat was precious. Plus, having animals close kept them safe from thieves, wolves, and whatever else wandered around in the dark winter nights. Inside the home, daily life went on. A mother might be spinning wool near the hearth. Children sat plucking feathers or shelling peas. Men sharpened tools or repaired broken handles. Everyone tried to stay near the fire without accidentally getting roasted. It was a delicate balance. Light came from the fire or a small tallow candle made from animal fat. These candles burned slowly but smelled, well, like animal fat. Let's just say medieval homes didn't smell like vanilla or lavender. Storage was simple too. Food hung from the ceiling beams so mice wouldn't steal it. Herbs dried in bunches. Jars of beans and peas lined the shelves. If the family had salted meat, it hung wrapped in cloth, waiting for a special meal. A home showed exactly how ready you were for winter. Full shelves meant hope. Empty shelves meant trouble. And of course, the cold made everything harder. Washing clothes, the water felt like liquid ice. Washing dishes, your fingers would go numb. Going outside to use the toilet, let's just say it was a cold, emotional experience. Still, the cottage had its good moments. Evenings were slow and calm. The fire popped softly. Someone told a story. Someone else carved a small wooden spoon. Children drifted to sleep. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls, but inside, the little home held together. It wasn't fancy, but it mattered. Because for the poor, this small, smoky, chilly cottage was more than just shelter. It was the center of their lives, a place where they worked, rested, ate, talked, and hoped for better weather. It protected them, sometimes just barely, from the harshness of medieval winter. If you lived in the Middle Ages and winter showed up, you couldn't just hop online and buy a fluffy jacket that looked like it ate a whole sheep. Nope. Poor people had to make do with whatever fabric, wool, or leftover scraps they could find. Winter clothes weren't stylish. They were more like, please don't let me freeze today outfits. Let's take a slow walk through what a poor medieval villager actually wore during a freezing winter morning. First, the base layer. A simple woolen tunic. Wool was the champion fabric of the Middle Ages. It kept you warm even when a little damp. And let's be honest, everything was at least a little damp back then. These tunics weren't soft like modern sweaters. They were rough, itchy, and sometimes felt like they were made from a grumpy sheep that didn't want to be helpful. But people wore them anyway, because the alternative was turning into a human popsicle. Over the tunic came another wool layer, and maybe another. Medieval fashion was basically put on everything you own and hope for the best. People didn't care about matching colors. If your tunic was brown and your cloak was dark green and your hood was some weird faded yellow, nobody judged you. Everyone was too busy trying not to freeze. Now, cloaks. These were the winter heroes. A cloak was like a portable blanket. You could walk in it, sleep in it, hide from the wind in it, and wrap your children inside it if things really got cold. Cloaks were usually made from thick wool, sometimes lined with old scraps of fabric. Poor people rarely had fur cloaks, unless the fur came from a small animal they caught or from a secondhand gift passed down so many times it was practically falling apart. But even an old scruffy fur lining could mean the difference between a comfortable walk and frostbite. Let's talk about hoods. Medieval hoods were big, long, and shaped like pointy bags. They hung around your shoulders and kept your head and neck warm. Winter wind loved attacking the neck area, so a hood was your best friend. Some even had long tails called leery pipes, which people used as scarves. Imagine a hood with a built-in scarf tail. Fashionable? Maybe not. Useful? Absolutely. Gloves were another story. Poor people didn't always have proper gloves. Instead, they used mittens made from leftover wool, or sometimes just wrapped their hands with cloth. It worked, kind of. But imagine trying to do chores with giant wool blobs for hands. Everything became slower. Everything felt clumsy. And forget doing anything delicate, your fingers were basically on vacation inside a wool cave. Now, shoes. Oh boy. Medieval shoes were not made for winter. They were thin leather, simple in shape, and had the insulation power of a wet noodle. So poor villagers stuffed their shoes with straw to stay warm. Yes, actual straw. Straw was their version of cozy insoles. You'd put it in your shoes, walk around, and replace it whenever it got crushed. Not stylish, but surprisingly effective. Some people wrapped woolen strips around their feet before putting on shoes. It wasn't elegant, but at least your toes didn't feel like they were dying. And when the snow was deep, villagers sometimes tied bits of cloth or old sacks around their feet to make snowshoes. Not the wooden kind, just regular shoes wrapped in whatever material they could find. basically medieval waterproof protection, even though nothing was actually waterproof. Let's not forget about leggings. Wool leggings, or hose, were worn under tunics. These weren't stretchy or comfy like modern leggings. They were tight, scratchy, and needed ties to keep them up. If your leggings came loose while working, you'd spend half your morning fixing them. Imagine chasing after chickens with one sock falling down. That kind of energy. Children often wore hand-me-downs that were too big or too small. If the sleeve was too long, you rolled it. If the tunic was too short, oh well, just pretend it's a fashion choice. Kids didn't get fancy winter clothes because they kept growing. You can't spend precious resources on something that won't fit next year. Sometimes in deep winter, people even slept in their clothes. Not because they were lazy, but because taking off layers in a freezing cottage was just asking for trouble. A medieval person looking at modern pajamas would probably say, "You change clothes before bed? In winter? On purpose?" But even with all these layers, winter still won most days. Clothes got wet from snow, they froze stiff if left outside, wool smelled like sheep forever, and drying clothes near the fire took hours. You'd hang them up and the whole house smelled like smoky, wet wool. Not exactly a vibe for a cozy evening. Still, every layer mattered. Every old patch kept out a little more wind. Every piece of wool, even if scratchy, added warmth. People patched their clothes constantly. A cloak might have 10 different fabrics stitched into it from different years. A tunic might be repaired so many times that the patches had patches. But medieval folks didn't throw things away. If a piece of cloth was still hanging on for dear life, they used it. Hats were simple wool caps. Some were tight-fitting, some floppy, some lumpy. No one cared. Warmth was the goal. A good hat could save your ears from freezing, and ears were important. You needed them to hear the sound of your cow escaping, or your neighbor calling for help, or your child knocking over something they definitely should not touch. When the weather was windier or colder than usual, villagers wrapped themselves in anything extra they had: shawls, blankets, even old sacks. Winter didn't care about your fashion sense, and neither did medieval villagers. So when a poor person stepped outside on a freezing January morning, they didn't look stylish. They looked like a walking pile of wool, straw, and determination. But those layers allowed them to work, to walk, to gather wood, to tend animals, and to survive another day. Their clothes told the story of their lives: simple, tough, repaired many times, and ready for whatever winter had planned next. When you think about farming, you probably imagine sunny fields, rows of green crops, tractors or maybe horses, and the occasional crow stealing corn. But winter? Winter in the Middle Ages turned farming into a strange, slow, almost impossible puzzle. For poor villagers, frozen fields meant that most of the work they normally did outside had to stop. Plowing? Impossible. Planting? Forget it. Even weeding was pointless because everything was under snow, frozen solid, or just hibernating quietly, mocking human effort. And yet winter work didn't disappear, it just changed. Farmers shifted from field labor to survival labor, indoor tasks and preparation for the next season. This was the time for careful attention to detail, small repairs, and slow, repetitive chores. Think of it as winter's version of homework, but nobody got gold stars. The first priority in winter farming was survival of what already existed. Animals had to be fed and cared for, crops that were stored had to be protected, and tools needed maintenance. This wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't exciting, but it was necessary. Without it, spring might bring hunger, illness, or worse. Livestock was central. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens needed attention every single day. Even when snow piled high outside, animals still had to eat, drink, and stay healthy. Villagers carried buckets of water, often breaking ice to reach it. They shoveled hay from the barn to the animals. They checked for frostbite or illness. A sick cow in January could mean no milk for weeks, and that was a big deal. Farms also had other chores that kept people moving. Gates and fences had to be repaired because snow and ice could break wooden structures. Paths and roads leading to wells or markets had to be cleared. Every swing of an axe, every shove of a shovel was a fight against the cold and a reminder that winter was still very much in charge. Some indoor farm work became the main focus. Peasants spent time sharpening tools, fixing broken carts, mending broken plows, and making sure everything was ready for spring. This kind of work was slow and repetitive, but it had a satisfying rhythm. A repaired plow meant a smoother day in March. A sharpened scythe meant fewer blisters and more efficiency. In winter, planning ahead was everything. Winter also meant storing and preparing food. Grain had to be checked for pests, vegetables from the fall needed inspection. Stored root crops like turnips, carrots, and cabbage were carefully managed. Rotten food could not be tolerated. There was no instant store to replace it. Villagers constantly rotated and monitored supplies, making sure that the family would survive the long months until fresh crops appeared. Even though fields were frozen, some small tasks could still happen outside. Snow could be shoveled for access to essential areas. Water sources could be managed. Sometimes peasants harvested what little remained above the snow, like hardy herbs or greens that could survive frost. Every tiny bit helped. Survival depended on small victories. Another challenge was the unpredictability of winter itself. A sudden thaw could flood low-lying fields, ruining stored crops or washing away early soil preparation. Villagers learned to anticipate these risks, but they couldn't control nature. They had to work carefully, making slow, deliberate decisions and always keeping an eye on the weather. Winter taught patience, because rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes could be fatal. And let's not forget about firewood. Although technically not farming, chopping wood and carrying it back to the house was essential for survival. Frozen fields meant walking long distances over snow to gather wood. Every log added warmth, made cooking possible, and allowed people to continue their daily routines. In a way, winter work extended the farm beyond the fields and into the forest. Even during these slow months, humor sometimes found its way into daily life. Imagine a villager slipping on ice while carrying a bucket of water, or a goat stubbornly refusing to eat hay until the person bends down just right. These moments were small, fleeting, but they reminded people that even in harsh conditions, life could still surprise you. They laughed quietly, shook their heads, and continued trudging, because there was work to do. Farming in winter wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sunny or picturesque. It was slow, cold, repetitive, and exhausting. But it built a rhythm. Villagers learned to rise early, move steadily, and pace themselves. Winter was a teacher. It showed them patience, careful planning, and endurance. Without this slow, deliberate work during frozen months, the next season's harvest might fail, and survival would be in jeopardy. As winter deepened, people spent more time indoors, working on tools, repairing fences, and planning for spring. Yet the fields were never forgotten. Villagers kept an eye on them, observed the snow and ice, and prepared to act the moment conditions allowed. Every day was a balance between survival and preparation. Every task, no matter how small, mattered. In essence, winter farming was less about producing new crops and more about protecting what existed, preparing for the future, and keeping life moving despite the frozen world. It was hard, quiet work. It was slow. It was tiring. But it kept families alive, kept animals healthy, and kept hope alive for warmer days ahead. When you think of winter chores in the Middle Ages, you might picture snow-covered fields, frozen rivers, and cold, unhappy villagers trudging through ice. But one of the most important parts of winter survival wasn't the snow. It was the animals. Yes, those four-legged, mooing, clucking, brain creatures that lived in barns and sometimes seemed to have more personality than the villagers themselves. For poor medieval people, livestock was essential. Cows gave milk, chickens laid eggs, if they weren't too cold or too grumpy, pigs provided meat, and goats did a little bit of everything. Losing an animal in winter could be catastrophic. No milk meant no breakfast. No eggs meant no omelets. And no pigs, well, that was a problem if you wanted bacon when spring finally returned. So caring for animals became a daily, non-negotiable duty, no matter how cold it got outside. Imagine waking up before sunrise, shivering as you pull on layers of wool, and heading to a barn that smells like hay, manure, and a touch of I don't want to be awake either. You push open the door and a wave of warmth mixed with animal smell greets you. The warmth is nice, but the smell, well, that's just part of the package. The first task was feeding. In winter, animals couldn't graze in fields. Snow covered the grass, frost hardened the soil, and leftover crops were scarce. People carried buckets of water, sometimes breaking ice to reach it, and delivered hay and other stored feed to the animals. Every cow, goat, and pig had to get enough nutrition to survive the cold, and feeding them took time and careful attention. Water was a challenge. Pails froze quickly, and streams or wells could be covered in ice. Villagers had to chip away frozen surfaces or fetch water in smaller batches so animals didn't get thirsty. It sounds simple, but try carrying frozen buckets in snow while wearing straw-stuffed shoes, and you'll understand why it was considered hard work. Cleaning barns was another essential chore. Straw got wet and dirty, droppings piled up. Animals couldn't live in filth without risk of disease, so villagers shoveled, swept, and replaced bedding. They moved slowly, deliberately, because a single slip on icy ground could result in a nasty fall, and the last thing anyone needed was an injury in winter. So caring for animals became a daily, non-negotiable duty, no matter how cold it got outside. People also checked for frostbite or illness. Extremities like ears and tails could get frostbitten if animals weren't protected. Sometimes villagers rubbed hooves and tails, wrapped small blankets around delicate animals, or guided them closer to the fire. It was tedious, slow work, but it mattered. Cold animals were less productive and less likely to survive, and that could mean disaster for the family. Every animal had its quirks. Cows sometimes refused to eat until someone scratched their back in the right spot. Chickens could be moody, squawking at anyone who dared enter the coop. Goats, being goats, were stubborn and sometimes climbed on things they shouldn't, knocking over a bucket or two. Part of the job was learning their personalities and figuring out how to get them through winter without too much chaos. Maintenance of the barn itself was also crucial. Thatched roofs could leak, wooden beams could weaken under snow, floors needed reinforcement to prevent drafts and moisture from freezing. Villagers spent hours fixing minor problems before they became major disasters. Every nail hammered, every straw patch replaced, every weak board strengthened meant animals stayed safe, and warmth was maintained. Nighttime didn't stop barn duties either. Some animals needed checking late at night. A cow might be restless. A goat might try to escape. Chickens could start pecking each other. Villagers had to remain vigilant, walking quietly through snow and mud, making sure everyone stayed safe, warm, and fed. Sometimes, caring for livestock offered small moments of quiet joy. Watching a calf nuzzle its mother, listening to chickens softly clucking in the hay, or feeling the warmth of a goat pressed against you. These were small, comforting pieces of life amidst the harsh cold. And yes, occasionally someone tripped over a sleeping animal or got kicked in the shin, which made for a brief laugh before the work continued. Humor, even small, was part of surviving winter. The rhythm of barn life in winter was slow but constant. Every morning, feed and water. Every day, cleaning, repairing, and tending. Every evening, a final check before people retreated to their homes and the warmth of the fire. It was repetitive, unglamorous work, but essential. Without it, the family would lose food, income, and possibly their own survival chances. And while this work might sound exhausting to us, it also had a rhythm. There's something meditative about feeding animals, cleaning stalls, and carefully moving through hay and straw in silence, surrounded by the soft sounds of contented, or sometimes grumpy, livestock. It's slow, it's calm. It's life in its most practical form. Winter was harsh, but villagers adapted. They worked steadily, carefully, layer by layer, task by task, and livestock care was the backbone of their winter work. Without it, nothing else could continue. Fields could wait, indoor crafts could wait, but animals? Never. So when you picture a medieval winter morning, imagine the smell of hay and smoke, the crunch of straw underfoot, the soft lowing of cows, the occasional squawk of a chicken, and a villager trudging through it all in wool, fur, and patched clothing. That is survival. That is dedication. That is winter life for the poor. If there's one thing that defined winter survival for poor people in the Middle Ages, it was wood. Not golden treasures, not fancy clothes, not even the perfect loaf of bread. Just wood. Because without wood, the hearth went cold, the porridge froze, and the entire household shivered. And trust me, winter doesn't negotiate with anyone who doesn't have a fire. Wood was life. It was warmth, food preparation, comfort, and sometimes even entertainment if you liked watching small fires flicker while snow piled outside. Villagers treated it like treasure, hoarding it carefully and rationing it every day. And gathering wood was not a leisurely stroll. Oh no, it was backbreaking, cold, muddy, snowy work that made modern gym workouts feel lazy. Imagine waking up early in winter, wrapping yourself in layers of wool, leather, and hope, and stepping outside into air that immediately steals the warmth from your nose and fingers. You trudge through snow, boots crunching, scarf over your face, eyes squinting at a gray, frozen landscape. Somewhere in the distance, a crow caws, as if judging your life choices. And there, waiting for you, is the forest, or at least a small grove of trees that hasn't been completely stripped of branches. Villagers didn't have chainsaws. They had axes, saws, and a lot of patience. Chopping wood meant swinging an axe over and over, careful not to hit your own foot or break the handle. Every cut had to be deliberate, steady, and strong. One slip, and not only could you get hurt, but you'd also lose precious time the fire desperately needed. After chopping, wood had to be collected, carried, and stacked. This wasn't a small task. A single bucket or bundle of wood might be heavy, wet, or awkward to hold. Often people carried it on their backs or in their arms while walking over icy paths, slippery rocks, or deep snow. Sometimes, two villagers worked together, passing logs in a human assembly line. It was teamwork, survival, and a small test of patience all in one. The forest itself posed challenges. Snow covered hidden roots, rocks, and branches. Ice made footing treacherous. Cold made fingers stiff, toes numb, and spirits a little grumpy. But villagers moved carefully, understanding that wood wasn't just fuel, it was life. A house without wood in winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Fires kept frostbite at bay, made food edible, and offered some mental comfort when outside world seemed harsh. Drying wood was another important step. Wet wood wouldn't burn well. Villagers had to find, cut, and sometimes split wood, then stack it near the house, close to the fire, and cover it if possible. This was especially tricky during snowstorms or when constant damp made everything heavy and slippery. Patience and careful stacking were key. One collapsed pile could mean hours of extra labor, or worse, lost heat for the night. Families often rationed wood carefully, only enough for cooking and a little warmth. Fires weren't allowed to roar wildly like modern fireplaces. One wasted log could mean a freezing night. Everyone learned to judge exactly how much wood was needed, and this judgment came with experience, trial, and often a bit of trial and error shivering. And let's not forget the humor that occasionally appeared in this work. Someone slipping on ice, logs tumbling, or a goat stealing a small branch. It happened. Villagers laughed quietly, shaking their heads, and carried on. Humor kept spirits alive. Winter was relentless, but humans had small ways to fight it with a smile, or at least a muttered complaint. Wood wasn't just for heat, it powered cooking too. Boiling water, simmering porridge, cooking vegetables, and occasionally baking bread all required careful attention to fuel. Running out of wood mid-cooking was not just inconvenient, it could ruin meals for the day. That's why gathering enough wood was treated as a critical chore, worthy of time and care. Beyond chopping and carrying, villagers also repaired tools used for wood collection. Axe handles broke, saws dulled, and baskets frayed. Maintaining these tools in winter conditions was slow work, but necessary. A broken axe could ruin an entire day's labor. And a day without wood? Well, that's a nightmare in medieval winter. Wood gathering also tied into community life. Sometimes neighbors helped each other carry larger logs or split wood for everyone. Some villages even had a small rotation. One day, one family chopped, another day, another. Sharing labor kept everyone alive and made the hardest tasks feel a little lighter. And while this work was exhausting, it was also oddly meditative. The rhythm of chopping, the crunch of snow under boots, the smell of pine or oak, and the quiet of a winter forest all combined into a slow, peaceful rhythm. A villager could think, plan, or just exist quietly while completing necessary work. The cold was harsh, but it had its own rhythm, one that forced focus and patience. By the end of the day, the villagers returned home tired, fingers stiff, noses red, and boots muddy, but their reward was a warm fire, a small meal, and a little satisfaction knowing that the house would stay warm tonight. Wood was more than fuel. It was survival, rhythm, and a small victory against winter's relentless cold. So, as you picture a medieval villager trudging through snow, swinging axes, hauling logs, and stacking piles of firewood, remember, every log meant life. Every swing of the axe meant warmth, and every careful step kept the family safe through another freezing night. If winter in the Middle Ages had a soundtrack, part of it would be the soft clink of tools in kitchens, the rhythmic thud of grain being ground, and the occasional murmur of someone muttering about overcooked porridge. Food in winter wasn't just tasty, it was life. Without it, survival was impossible. And for poor villagers, preparing and preserving food was a slow, careful, and sometimes smelly art. Unlike today, villagers didn't have grocery stores or refrigerators. They had what they stored in autumn or what they could grow, hunt, or barter for in winter. This meant that careful planning in late summer and fall determined whether a family would make it through December, January, and February with full stomachs, or spend months rationing tiny portions of bread and beans. Grain was the foundation of most diets. Wheat, barley, oats, these were ground into flour for bread or porridge. Grinding was done with a hand mill or a small community mill, and it was slow work. A single person could spend hours grinding just enough for one meal. The process was repetitive, dusty, and a little boring, but also essential. Flour was gold in a world without refrigeration. Bread was baked in small ovens or over open hearths. It wasn't fluffy or fancy. It was dense, sometimes hard, and meant to last. A loaf could be sliced thinly and rationed over several days. Making bread involved careful attention. Too long in the fire, and it became a brick. Too short, and it was mushy. And in winter, when firewood was precious, every minute of baking mattered. Vegetables from the autumn harvest were stored carefully. Root crops like carrots, turnips, and cabbages were packed in straw or placed in cool, dry corners. These vegetables could last for weeks if protected from frost. Villagers checked them regularly, removed any rotten pieces, and sometimes boiled or stewed them to stretch their shelf life. Eating the same vegetables day after day might sound boring, but in winter, variety was a luxury. Meat was another important part of winter diets. Pigs, chickens, and goats could provide protein, but meat had to be preserved. Salting was the most common method. Salted meat could last for weeks or months if stored carefully. Villagers rubbed salt into cuts, hung pieces in cool, dry spaces, and sometimes smoked them over the fire. This wasn't a quick process. It required patience, careful attention, and a strong stomach for salty, sometimes tough food. Dairy products also needed careful handling. Milk could sour quickly in cold months, so villagers turned it into cheese or butter. Cheese was especially valuable because it lasted longer and could be eaten when fresh milk wasn't available. Butter was often stored in cool containers, sometimes wrapped in leaves or cloth. Even a small amount of dairy could make a big difference in daily meals. Cooking itself was slow. Most meals were stews, porridges, or boiled vegetables. Cooking over an open fire required constant attention. Too little heat, and the meal didn't cook. Too much, and it burned. Steam, smoke, and the occasional splash of boiling water were part of daily life. People worked carefully, balancing firewood use with cooking needs. Every action was deliberate, because waste was dangerous in winter. Meals were simple. Breakfast might be porridge with a bit of milk. Lunch could be bread and beans. Dinner might be a stew with root vegetables and a piece of salted meat. Rarely was there spice or luxury. Flavor came from patience, slow cooking, and sometimes a little imagination. Even in the harshest winter, meals were a moment of comfort and warmth. Children often helped. They could stir porridge, shell beans, or fetch small bundles of wood for the fire. Teaching children to help with food preparation was essential for survival. By the time they grew up, they knew exactly how to feed a family in the coldest months. Preservation was not just about surviving today, it was about planning for tomorrow. Villagers rotated food carefully, ensuring nothing spoiled. They made sure enough porridge remained for breakfast, enough salted meat for the evening, and enough vegetables to last until the next day. Winter was a season of careful attention to every bite. Waste was dangerous. Efficiency was life. Even with all this hard work, there were small moments of calm and humor. A child might drop a vegetable and try to eat it before it hit the floor. A pot might bubble over, leaving a mess that had to be cleaned before the next meal. Villagers might argue quietly about whose turn it was to stir the pot. These little moments didn't make life easier, but they added a human touch to the long, cold winter days. The smell of food cooking was a comfort in itself. In a cold, dark cottage, the aroma of porridge, bread, or stewing vegetables was like a small hug. It reminded everyone that despite the frozen fields, the icy wind, and the snow-covered paths, life went on. The hearth was warmth, food was life, and careful preparation was survival. So, as you imagine a medieval winter day, picture villagers chopping vegetables slowly, stirring thick porridge, handling salted meat with care, and watching over their small stores of grain. Every action was deliberate. Every chore mattered. Every meal was a small victory against the cold. Winter in the Middle Ages was long, cold, and often unforgiving. The frozen fields meant that farmers couldn't plant or harvest, and the harsh weather made travel difficult. But life didn't stop, far from it. Poor villagers found ways to keep busy, productive, and, most importantly, alive. That's where cottage industries and handcrafting came in, a slower, quieter, and surprisingly essential part of winter work. Cottage industries were small-scale activities carried out at home. They weren't glamorous, they weren't factory-made, they were practical, repetitive, and aimed at survival. And they often required patience, skill, and a steady hand. These were the activities that kept families occupied during long, cold months when outside work was nearly impossible. One of the most common winter activities was spinning wool. Villagers collected raw wool from sheep, cleaned it, carded it, which means untangling the fibers, and then spun it into yarn. Spinning was slow work, but it had a rhythm. The soft whir of the spinning wheel or the scratchy pull of hand-spun fibers was almost meditative. People could sit by the fire, spinning for hours, letting their minds wander while their hands kept busy. Wool spun in winter would later become clothing, blankets, or patches for coats. Every strand counted. Weaving followed spinning. Once wool was spun into yarn, it could be woven into cloth. Looms were simple but effective. Villagers, often women, sat at them for hours, creating strips of cloth that could become tunics, socks, or blankets. It was meticulous work. One mistake could ruin a whole section, but it was rewarding in the slow, satisfying way that only handcrafting can be. Sewing and mending were also winter staples. Clothes from the previous seasons were patched, repaired, or repurposed. If a coat had holes from wood chopping, or a child had grown out of their tunic, winter was the time to fix it. Needle, thread, and a little patience were all that were needed, though a few curses at the stubborn fabric were also common. Other cottage industries included basket making, leatherworking, and simple woodworking. Baskets were used for carrying food, firewood, or eggs. Leather could be fashioned into shoes, belts, pouches, or gloves. Wood could become tools, small furniture, or simple toys for children. Every item created was meant to be used, not admired for beauty. Function came first, always. Even soap making or candle making could be a part of winter crafts. Families often prepared tallow candles for the long nights. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was basic but essential. Every household needed these small, practical items to survive through cold months. Children often participated in handcrafts too. They might help spin wool, shell peas, or weave small baskets. Learning these skills early meant they could contribute to survival while also preparing for adulthood. Winter was as much about education and practical skills as it was about enduring cold and darkness. These indoor activities were repetitive and slow, but that was part of their charm and their function. Slow work allowed people to conserve energy, stay warm near the fire, and create essential items without leaving the safety of their homes. There was a rhythm to it. Spin, weave, patch, repair, repeat. It wasn't exciting, but it was life-sustaining. Cottage industries also encouraged sharing in community. Sometimes villagers traded goods with neighbors, some yarn for a basket, some leather for bread. Winter was a time to help each other, exchange materials, and ensure that everyone survived. Even small acts of cooperation could make the difference between comfort and misery in harsh months. Despite the monotony, handcrafting had moments of humor and warmth. Children might tangle yarn or drop tools. Animals in the home might sneak onto work tables, scattering materials. Villagers might laugh quietly at their own mistakes or sigh dramatically when thread broke mid-stitch. These little moments made the work tolerable, even pleasant in a quiet, cozy way. And there's something calming about cottage industries. Watching hands move steadily, hearing the soft click of a loom or the scratchy pull of hand-spun fibers, all of it creates a rhythm. It's slow, deliberate, and repetitive, in a way that's almost meditative. Winter may have been harsh, but it had its own gentle cadence inside homes filled with quiet work. By the end of the day, families had accomplished small but essential tasks. Clothes were repaired, yarn was spun, baskets were finished. Small tools were sharpened or repaired. These tasks didn't just pass the time, they were crucial for survival. And even though the work wasn't glamorous, it gave a sense of purpose, keeping spirits alive despite freezing winds outside. So when you picture a poor medieval household in winter, imagine people sitting close to the fire, hands moving slowly, quietly, creating things that mattered. Children learn, adults repair. Everyone contributes. The world outside is frozen and harsh, but inside, there is warmth, purpose, and slow, satisfying productivity. Winter was beautiful, silent, and peaceful. Until someone got sick. And in the Middle Ages, illness during freezing months was not just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Poor villagers didn't have doctors on every corner, hospitals were rare, and medicine was basic at best. Staying healthy in winter required vigilance, care, and sometimes a bit of luck. The first challenge was cold itself. Long exposure to freezing temperatures could lead to frostbite, chilblains, or hypothermia. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses were the most vulnerable. Villagers relied on layers of wool, leather, and fur, but even the best clothing couldn't completely prevent the cold from creeping in. If someone spent too long outside gathering wood, feeding animals, or walking through snow, they risked serious injury. Illnesses could spread quickly in small cottages. People slept close together, shared food, and stayed inside for warmth. That meant that if one person caught a cold or flu, it often traveled through the family like wildfire. Fevers, chills, coughs, and general misery became part of daily life. There were no antibiotics, no thermometers, and no heated blankets. People just endured, treated symptoms the best they could, and hoped for the best. Treatment options were limited. Herbs, poultices, and home remedies were common. Chamomile, thyme, and rosemary might be used to soothe symptoms or create warm teas. Garlic, honey, and vinegar appeared in mixtures designed to prevent infection or boost strength. Sometimes these remedies worked. Sometimes they didn't, but they were all people had, and they were better than nothing. Wounds were another concern. Chopping wood, handling livestock, and working outside in icy conditions often led to cuts, scrapes, and bruises. Even a small wound could become dangerous if infection set in. Villagers cleaned wounds with water and herbs, wrapped them carefully, and prayed that no infection took hold. Cleanliness was basic but critical, and everyone learned early to treat minor injuries before they became serious. Nutrition played a huge role in health. Poor villagers relied on what they could grow, store, or barter. Grain, root vegetables, and small amounts of meat or dairy provided energy and strength. Skipping meals or having insufficient calories could weaken the body, making illness more likely. That's why winter food preparation and preservation were so important. They weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Kids needed warmth, food, and attention to avoid sickness. Elderly villagers, often weaker and less resilient, required extra care. Families adapted, keeping children and elders closer to the fire, making sure they ate enough, and helping them with daily chores. It was a slow, careful balancing act. Hygiene was another challenge. Baths were rare in winter. Water froze easily, and heating it required fuel. People washed minimally, relying on scrubbing hands, face, and occasionally feet. Dirt, smoke, and the general odor of living in a crowded, cold space were accepted as part of life. Yet, even this minimal hygiene helped prevent some infections. It wasn't luxurious, but it was practical. Mental health was affected too. Long nights, short days, and freezing temperatures could make people feel low or restless. Villagers coped with storytelling, quiet conversation, simple games, and sometimes songs. Humor, small rituals, and storytelling were more than entertainment. They were survival tools for the mind as much as the body. A laugh, even small, could lift spirits and keep families going through long, cold winters. Medical care from outsiders was rare for poor villagers. Wise women or local healers sometimes offered advice or remedies. They knew herbs, poultices, and basic techniques to treat common ailments. But serious illnesses were often untreatable. People relied heavily on experience, observation, and preventative measures like staying warm, eating well, and avoiding unnecessary exposure to cold. Sleep was another vital defense. Long winter nights encouraged rest. Even though beds were shared, straw-filled, and sometimes itchy, sleep helped the body recover, build strength, and resist illness. Families often rested as much as possible, conserving energy for work, chores, and survival in the cold. Accidents, colds, frostbite, digestive issues, and fevers were all part of winter life. Surviving required awareness, patience, and daily vigilance. Families learned from experience what clothing kept frostbite away, which teas soothed coughs, how to avoid slips on ice, and when to rest near the hearth. Survival was as much about knowledge and preparation as it was about luck. Despite the challenges, villagers showed remarkable resilience. Communities cared for one another. Neighbors shared firewood, herbs, or extra food. Simple acts of kindness could save a life. Humor and small joys like watching children play in snow or listening to a chicken cluck reminded people that life continued even in the cold. So when you picture a poor medieval household in winter, imagine more than frozen fields and snow-covered roofs. Imagine careful attention to clothing, food, animals, chores, and health. Imagine quiet work by the fire, herbal remedies on the shelf, and small acts of care keeping families alive. Winter was harsh, but human ingenuity, patience, and resilience made survival possible. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't all hardship, chores, and shivering. Even in the coldest, darkest months, poor villagers found ways to entertain themselves and create small comforts that made life a little more bearable. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't extravagance, and it wasn't always glamorous, but it was enough to keep spirits warm when the world outside was freezing. Entertainment in winter was simple. People didn't have books in every home, video games, or streaming services. Most cottages had little beyond a fire, a few simple tools, and sometimes some raw materials for crafting. But imagination and patience made up for scarcity. Stories were a central part of evening entertainment. Parents told tales to children, neighbors shared news or gossip, and wandering storytellers occasionally passed through villages. These stories weren't just fun, they were a way to learn, remember traditions, and pass time when the cold kept everyone indoors. Humor played a big role. Villagers often joked quietly with each other while performing chores or laughed at small accidents, like a clumsy child tripping on straw, a goat stealing food, or a bucket spilling water near the fire. Laughter in winter was more than amusement. It was a survival tool. Keeping spirits up helped people endure cold nights, tedious work, and long stretches of dark. Games were another source of entertainment. Children, and sometimes adults, played simple games using sticks, stones, or small handmade toys. These were not organized tournaments, just quiet, low-key activities that brought fun into the home. Games were brief breaks from chores, but meaningful in keeping boredom at bay. Imagination turned sticks into swords, stones into treasures, and the hearth into a castle of sorts. Music also offered comfort. Some villagers played simple instruments like flutes, drums, or small stringed instruments. Others sang, sometimes softly, sometimes loudly, depending on the mood. Singing while spinning wool, chopping herbs, or working by the hearth helped pass the time and created a sense of community. Even the simplest melodies brought warmth to cold hearts. Textiles and crafting contributed to both work and comfort. While spinning, weaving, and sewing were practical chores, they also offered quiet satisfaction. Watching yarn turn into cloth or mending a torn coat gave villagers a sense of accomplishment. It was a slow, meditative process that combined productivity with calm, comforting rhythm. Food also provided comfort beyond sustenance. Even simple porridge, warm bread, or boiled vegetables could feel luxurious in a freezing cottage. Hot meals by the fire, shared quietly among family members, created small but significant moments of warmth and satisfaction. Sweetened porridge with a bit of honey, if available, felt like a treat. Every meal became a comfort, a little reward after hours of hard, cold work. Candles and the firelight themselves were sources of joy. In long winter nights, flickering flames created warmth, soft light, and a sense of peace. People gathered close to the fire, telling stories, mending clothes, or simply enjoying the quiet. The gentle crackle of burning wood and the soft shadows on the walls made even the coldest nights feel a little more inviting. Animals, too, provided entertainment and comfort. Watching chickens peck in the straw, a cat curl up near the fire, or a goat stubbornly exploring the cottage brought small, quiet joy. Animals were also sources of warmth. Sharing space with a friendly creature near the hearth made life less lonely and less cold. Neighbors and community gatherings added to the winter experience. Markets, though limited in winter, occasionally brought people together. Festivals, feasts, or religious celebrations offered rare opportunities for socialization. Even in the simplest villages, these events broke the monotony and reminded people that life continued outside their frozen homes. Small traditions, rituals, and quiet celebrations were vital. Lighting candles on dark evenings, saying prayers for protection, or sharing small gifts or treats kept hope alive. Winter was harsh, but these little customs reminded villagers that warmth, comfort, and joy could still exist even amid hardship. Even the act of resting itself was a comfort. After long days of chores, tending animals, preparing food, or gathering firewood, villagers would sit by the fire, sip warm drinks, and simply breathe. Silence, broken only by the occasional sound of wind outside or a crackling fire, became a small pleasure. Winter's cold forced people to slow down, to appreciate these tiny moments of calm, and to find satisfaction in what might seem ordinary. All of these small comforts, stories, humor, games, music, crafting, firelight, food, animals, community, and quiet rest added texture to life in winter. They weren't luxuries, they weren't fancy. They were subtle, everyday joys that kept people going. And in a way, they were as important as any coat, loaf of bread, or pile of firewood. So when you imagine poor medieval families surviving freezing winters, picture them not just working and shivering, but also laughing quietly, spinning yarn, telling stories, playing small games, and sharing warmth near the fire. These small comforts were the threads that held life together, making the cold months not just bearable, but even meaningful in their slow, quiet rhythm. Even in the harsh, freezing winters of the Middle Ages, poor villagers found reasons to celebrate. Life was hard, cold, and often exhausting, but the long nights also held special occasions, moments to gather, share warmth, and take a brief pause from survival. Festivals and holiday celebrations were not just fun, they were essential for morale and community life. One of the most important festivals was Christmas. Yes, it wasn't exactly the snowy, decorated wonderland we imagine today, but it was meaningful. Villagers prepared for weeks, saving small treats, decorating homes with simple greenery like holly, ivy, or evergreen branches, and gathering whatever food they could spare. The air was filled with anticipation, and the long winter nights seemed a little brighter. Church played a central role. Midnight mass, prayers, and religious rituals marked the season. Villagers often traveled to the local church, sometimes trudging through snow and ice to participate in ceremonies. It wasn't easy, but the sense of togetherness, community, and faith warmed hearts far more than any fire could. Feasting, even in a humble way, was a highlight. People who had managed to preserve salted meat, root vegetables, bread, and occasionally a treat like cheese or honey could prepare small feasts. It wasn't about luxury, it was about sharing what little they had. A single roasted chicken or a pot of porridge made with care became a festive meal, and families savored it as a reward for enduring long, cold weeks. Music and singing were central to celebrations. Villagers sang hymns, carols, and folk songs. Sometimes neighbors joined together, creating small choirs of voices echoing through the cottages or across village squares. Even if the singing was off-key, it brought joy, laughter, and a sense of community. Music in winter wasn't just entertainment, it was warmth for the soul. Games and simple entertainment returned during festival times. Children and adults alike played small games, acted out stories, or competed in lighthearted contests. These moments allowed people to laugh, forget frostbitten toes, and feel normal for a brief while. Even animals sometimes became part of the fun, as goats or chickens wandered into festivities, creating chaos and amusement. Candlelight and fires became focal points for celebration. Villagers decorated hearths and windows with whatever was available, creating a small sense of magic in otherwise dark and frozen cottages. Shadows danced across walls, creating moving stories in the firelight. Even without modern lights or decorations, these simple touches brought joy and comfort. Some communities also held small fairs or markets if the weather allowed. These were opportunities to trade goods, share news, and interact with neighbors. A single bartered item, a bit of cloth for honey, a loaf of bread for a small toy, was enough to create excitement and connection. The human need for social interaction didn't pause for winter, and festivals provided a sanctioned, joyful way to fulfill it. Preparation for festivals itself became a form of entertainment. People cleaned cottages, repaired clothes, and cooked meals with care. Children helped gather greenery, stir pots, or carry firewood for the festivities. The anticipation of a small celebration created warmth, purpose, and shared energy even before the festival began. Even in extremely poor households, the act of celebrating was symbolic. Lighting a candle, decorating a small corner, or sharing a simple meal created hope. These traditions reminded villagers that winter wasn't endless, that the seasons would turn, and that life continued despite hardship. Celebrations were a pause, a breath, a tiny rebellion against the cold and scarcity. Humor, again, was a key ingredient. Villagers laughed at awkward dances, spilled food, off-key singing, or playful children. Laughter broke tension, reminded people of their resilience, and turned small mishaps into memories. Humor was never wasted. It was a tool, a comfort, and sometimes a survival strategy. Winter festivals were slow, quiet, and modest, but they mattered. They brought together families and communities, reminded people of traditions, offered brief relief from toil, and provided hope for the months ahead. The cold outside was relentless, but inside cottages, firelight, singing, stories, and shared food created warmth, connection, and joy. So, when imagining a poor medieval village in winter, picture more than frozen fields and chores. Picture small cottages filled with flickering fires, quiet singing, shared meals, laughter, and anticipation. Picture families wrapping themselves in layers of wool while savoring every little comfort. Festivals and celebrations made winter bearable. They gave life rhythm, meaning, and a tiny spark of light during the darkest months. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just cold, it could be brutal. Snowstorms, icy winds, and freezing rains often turned everyday life into a challenge of survival. For poor villagers, extreme weather meant adapting quickly, planning carefully, and sometimes just hoping that luck would be on their side. Snowstorms could appear suddenly. One morning, villagers might wake to find fields, paths, and roads buried under several feet of snow. Animals struggled to move, water sources froze, and supplies became harder to reach. A snowstorm wasn't just an inconvenience. It could isolate families for days, making even small chores dangerous or impossible. Villagers adapted in small, practical ways. Pathways to essential places like barns, wells, or neighbors' homes were shoveled and maintained as best as possible. People walked carefully, using sticks or poles to test footing in deep snow. Snowshoes weren't common, but sturdy boots, layered clothing, and patience were key survival tools. Every step had to be deliberate, because one slip could result in injury far from help. Windstorms were equally dangerous. Icy gusts could drive snow into cottages, rattle windows, and make even indoor tasks feel miserable. Villagers reinforced doors and windows with cloth, wood, or whatever materials they could find. Fires were kept burning as a first line of defense against cold drafts. Staying close to the hearth wasn't laziness, it was survival. Extreme weather also affected food and water. Wells could freeze, making water scarce. Stored grains or vegetables risked damage from moisture or ice. Villagers monitored supplies constantly, rationing carefully and prioritizing essential meals. Even a single day without proper food or water could weaken bodies and make illness more likely, so preparation and vigilance were critical. Snowstorms also disrupted travel.
Villagers who needed to visit markets, deliver goods, or gather firewood had to delay trips or find alternative routes. Sometimes neighbors cooperated, combining efforts to reach distant locations safely. Sharing labor during storms wasn't just practical, it was a matter of survival. Everyone relied on each other more during extreme conditions. Animals were affected too. Livestock needed protection from wind, snow, and ice. Villagers ensured barns were secure, bedding was dry, and water was accessible despite freezing conditions. Extra hay might be provided, and animals were checked frequently for signs of stress or frostbite. Caring for animals in storms required both strength and patience, because even small mistakes could be disastrous. Indoor life changed as well. Families spent longer hours near fires, focusing on slow, essential tasks. Spinning, weaving, mending, and food preparation became the core of daily work. Repetitive and quiet, these tasks kept people occupied and productive while waiting out storms. The rhythm of indoor chores provided both mental comfort and practical survival. Storms also brought unexpected humor and creativity. Children might build small snow structures when the weather allowed, animals often caused mischief, and people found inventive ways to keep tasks manageable. A goat might sneak into the house to escape the cold, or a child might slide across icy paths, small moments of amusement in an otherwise harsh environment. Lighting and fire became even more critical. Candles, torches, and hearth fires provided warmth, visibility, and comfort. Villagers rationed candles carefully, using them only when necessary, while the hearth became the central focus of the household. Fires offered not just heat, but also a sense of security, a flickering companion during long, dark hours. Extreme weather required flexibility and planning. Villagers learned to anticipate storms by watching the sky, observing wind shifts, or remembering past patterns. Supplies were stockpiled, animals were fed in advance, and essential tasks were prioritized. Winter was unpredictable, but experience and vigilance gave people a small edge against nature's fury. Even though storms were harsh, they offered moments of reflection. Sitting by the fire, watching snow swirl outside, or listening to the wind howl across frozen fields created a sense of quiet awe. Villagers could think, plan, or simply rest while the storm raged. There was a rhythm to survival: patience, preparation, and enduring whatever nature threw their way. Community was especially important during extreme weather. Neighbors checked on one another, shared resources, and sometimes worked together to dig paths or bring supplies. Isolation could be dangerous, but co-op storms strengthened social bonds, reminding people that survival wasn't just an individual effort, it was communal. Despite the challenges, villagers endured. They adapted, worked slowly and carefully, and found ways to survive even the harshest storms. Life in winter was repetitive, cold, and often exhausting, but the combination of preparation, patience, and small joys, stories, crafts, laughter, helped them push through. So, when imagining a poor medieval village during a snowstorm, picture layers of wool, trudging feet through deep snow, careful attention to animals and supplies, cozy fires in cottages, and neighbors helping one another. Storms were harsh, but people survived, creating rhythm, resilience, and small victories against the cold. As winter dragged on, poor villagers had to think ahead. Surviving the cold was one challenge, but preparing for spring was another. Fields would soon thaw, animals would become more active, and planting season would arrive. Winter was not just a time of survival, it was also a quiet, slow period of preparation for the year ahead. Planning for spring started with seeds and tools. Villagers checked stored seeds from the previous harvest, ensuring they were dry and viable. Grain, beans, peas, and vegetables were sorted, cleaned, and sometimes tested. Any spoiled seeds were discarded, and the best were kept for sowing. Even a single batch of bad seeds could ruin the upcoming season, so attention to detail was critical. Tools were repaired or sharpened during winter. Plows, sickles, hoes, and spades were cleaned, fixed, and reinforced. Handles were replaced, edges sharpened, and ropes checked. Winter's slow indoor rhythm made it the perfect time for this work. Tools had to be ready before the busy, muddy, and unpredictable spring arrived. One broken plow in spring could cost days of work, and in a poor household, every day mattered. Villagers also planned animal care. Spring meant birthing season for many animals. Sheep, goats, and sometimes cows would deliver offspring, so families prepared shelters, straw bedding, and extra feed. Young animals were vulnerable, and early preparation during winter increased the chances of survival. It was a quiet, patient type of planning done indoors, often near the warmth of the hearth. Winter work also included mending clothing for the upcoming months. Heavy coats, gloves, boots, and blankets were patched and reinforced. Wool was spun into yarn, fabric woven, and garments carefully repaired. Spring could still be cold and wet, so clothing needed to last. Every stitch counted, and slow, repetitive mending became both survival work and quiet craft. Food stores were checked carefully and preserved. Root vegetables, salted meat, and stored grains had to last until new crops became available. Families rotated food, monitored spoilage, and sometimes exchanged goods with neighbors to ensure variety and quality. Winter wasn't just about surviving today, it was about bridging the gap until spring, when fresh food would appear. Even indoor planning took a creative form. Villagers sometimes mapped out plots for planting, noting which crops went where, which fields needed repairs, and which areas required extra attention. Knowledge from previous seasons guided these plans. Experience and observation turned winter into a strategic season, despite the cold and stillness outside. Children were involved as well. They helped spin, repair tools, and gather seeds, learning practical skills for the future. Survival in spring depended on preparation in winter, so every small task mattered. Families also made practical items for spring chores. Baskets, ropes, and small tools were crafted or repaired. Barrels and containers were fixed or reinforced. These items would help with planting, harvesting, and carrying water. Winter work wasn't glamorous, but it laid the foundation for the year ahead. Even leisure during winter contributed indirectly to spring preparation. Storytelling, games, or quiet reflection allowed villagers to conserve energy, maintain morale, and think ahead. Patience was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Calm minds and rested bodies improved productivity when spring work finally arrived. Community cooperation remained essential. Families shared knowledge, traded seeds, helped repair communal tools, and planned planting strategies together. Winter was long, but working together allowed villages to approach spring with stronger resources and better preparation. Isolation was dangerous, so collaboration became a survival strategy as well as a social practice. Humor, too, played a role. Misplaced seeds, tangled yarn, or clumsy handling of tools could create small laughs. Even in a slow, serious season, humor lightened the mood and reminded villagers that winter, though harsh, could still be endured with patience and creativity. By the end of winter, families were ready. Seeds sorted, tools sharpened, clothing repaired, and shelters reinforced. They had survived the cold, maintained their animals, preserved food, and quietly prepared for a new season. The slow, repetitive, sometimes tedious work of winter had a purpose. Life continued, and spring would come. So when you imagine poor medieval villagers in late winter, picture not just survival, but preparation. Picture hands spinning yarn, sharpening tools, repairing garments, sorting seeds, and quietly planning the year ahead. Winter wasn't just about endurance. It was a patient, deliberate season of preparation, laying the foundation for life to continue when the frost finally lifted.
After months of freezing winds, snow-covered fields, and long, dark nights, spring finally arrived. For poor villagers in the Middle Ages, the change in season was both a relief and a fresh challenge. Winter's harsh grip loosened, but new tasks and responsibilities quickly replaced the old ones. Life shifted from survival to revival, and every family had to adjust carefully to the changing season.
The first sign of spring was subtle. Snow began to melt, rivers and streams flowed freely, and the sun appeared a little longer each day. Birds returned, and the air carried a faint hint of warmth. Villagers felt it in their bones. Lighter days meant more work, but also the promise of renewal. The mood in cottages lifted. Even a few rays of sun through a small window could brighten hearts after months of gray skies and frost. Fields were the priority. After winter, soil was often wet and heavy with mud. Villagers prepared it for planting by repairing fences, removing debris, and turning over frozen earth as best they could. Tools sharpened and mended during winter now came into action. Hoes, plows, and spades moved through fields with purpose, transforming frozen, lifeless soil into potential gardens of food and hope. Seeds carefully stored through winter were finally planted. Grain, beans, peas, and vegetables were sown in prepared rows. Villagers worked slowly but steadily, mindful that every seed represented months of survival ahead. The rhythm of planting, dig, drop, cover, pat, was repetitive, meditative, and satisfying. Each small patch of soil prepared was a triumph, a step toward abundance after scarcity. Animals also required attention. Livestock that had been sheltered and fed through the cold months now needed grazing, cleaning, and careful monitoring as they became more active. Sheep, goats, cows, and chickens were moved to fresh pastures, and young animals born in late winter were nurtured. Spring work combined careful planning, physical effort, and patience. No one wanted to lose livestock after surviving the winter. Household chores changed too. Firewood still burned, but less fuel was needed as temperatures rose. Clothing was lighter, and repairs focused more on gardening or outdoor labor rather than staying warm indoors. Food preparation began to include fresh herbs and early greens, adding variety after months of preserved vegetables and salted meat. Villagers relished the small taste of freshness that hinted at abundance. Community activities increased as well. Villagers shared tools, labor, and advice on planting and animal care. Markets became more accessible, and the exchange of goods, seeds, or knowledge flourished. After months of relative isolation indoors, social interactions renewed energy and reinforced the bonds that helped communities survive harsh winters. Spring also brought a sense of renewal and mental relief. Children ran outdoors, animals explored new pastures, and families could enjoy light and warmth in ways impossible during winter. Even small pleasures like the smell of wet earth, the sound of flowing water, or the sight of budding plants reminded villagers that hardship had a cycle and hope was tangible. Humor returned in outdoor work as well. Muddy boots, playful animals, and clumsy handling of tools created moments of laughter. After months of careful, slow indoor work, villagers embraced the chaos of spring with a lighter heart. Even slipping in the mud or accidentally dropping seeds could become a shared joke that strengthened community bonds. Winter skills remained useful. Patience learned while spinning wool, mending clothes, and preserving food carried over into planting and animal care. Careful observation of soil, weather, and livestock habits helped villagers anticipate challenges. Winter's slow, repetitive routines had trained them for attentive, steady work that was essential in spring. The shift from winter to spring was gradual. It wasn't just a change in weather, it was a shift in pace, focus, and energy. Survival chores became productive labor. Preparations for the next harvest, care of animals, and planting cycles defined daily life. Villagers adjusted slowly, taking lessons from winter and applying them to the new season. Spring festivals and celebrations added cheer. Early harvest rituals, religious ceremonies, and communal gatherings brought joy, marking the transition from scarcity to growth. Even poor households could participate with small meals, songs, or simple decorations. Celebration reminded everyone that life was cyclical. Winter hardship passed, and abundance, even in small amounts, returned. So, as you imagine medieval villagers stepping into spring, picture people moving from frozen cottages to muddy fields, hands working soil, children running through thawing yards, animals grazing, and communities exchanging tools and seeds. Picture quiet relief and patient effort blending together in the slow rhythm of seasonal change. Winter was survived, spring was embraced, and life continued in its careful, steady, and sometimes humorous way. Winter didn't erase the memory of cold nights or frozen fields, but it brought energy, hope, and a tangible reminder that survival, patience, and preparation were always rewarded. For poor medieval families, each season was both a challenge and a gift, a continuation of life, work, and quiet resilience.